Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host Rich Gear here with you, and Doug has got an interesting topic for us today. It's really, did we title the show "What If"?
I think so. Yeah.
We're gonna go use a little I think a little bit of whimsy here. Alternative universe. I love this for science fiction. This is really a staple of science fiction and even comic book fodder. So this kind of stuff appeals to me. But so Doug, what are we going to talk about? What if about?
Suppose Darwin never publishes his theory. Let's suppose that there was just a few things that happened back then that caused him not to publish his theory. Let's suppose Lyell never published his Principles of Geology.
Mm-hmm.
Then he wouldn't have influenced Darwin.
That's true.
And suppose Wallace, Alfred Wallace, had never pushed Darwin into publication because he had come up with somewhat of the same ideas.
I noticed, Doug, in recent years, Wallace has become giving almost co-equal status with Darwin for the theory of evolution. He's becoming more and more known, at least in evolutionary circles. But, well, Doug, what if? So, suppose Darwin never published his theory.
Now, one might argue that probably there was sort of like a psychological necessity for Darwin's theory to come about anyway, because
that's kind of what I would argue, quite frankly.
There's a propensity for people to gravitate towards wanting to get rid of God one way or another. Of course, people like Voltaire and people in the French Revolution,
the Enlightenment, which I call the Endarkenment, but
but things happened during that time that really started a lot of this thinking to occur, and there is within the heart of man that whole propensity towards evil, towards wanting to push away God and either at least put him in the background, way back in the dark past. There's the whole movement.
That's the crux of the issue. To me, almost this is like the tail wagging the dog a little bit, because it's almost like we almost have to go back to the garden. What if Adam and Eve had not taken and not eaten from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? What we're talking about is, okay, well, the fall has happened, but for some reason or some in an alternate universe, Darwin down the road just was inspired to not, or was not inspired to do it, or Wallace did not have his vision, or Lyell basically accepted the creationary geologist stuff,
Suppose the captain of the Beagle, Fitzroy, never gave Darwin Lyell's Principles of Geology. So there's all these different events that took place here in the past, which were pivotal for Darwin to publish his theory of evolution. And then there's a whole series of cascading consequences that took place as a result.
Call those the domino effect.
We had Marx relied upon Darwin. Nietzsche also relied upon Darwin.
We said Marx.
Marx and Hitler.
Hitler also later on. That was well done. Jerry Bergman's book really documents that quite profoundly. And so there's a lot of, we know the consequence of the Darwin. So are we saying, Doug, let's suppose man's still being evil, the fall still happened, but Darwin did not publish his book, or Lyell before him did not publish Principles of Geology, which really set the standard for long ages. Okay, basically it was the real scientific way, I put that in quotations, where they began to question the chronology and the sequence of events in the biblical record. So in other words, if the world was hundreds of thousands or even 1 million years old, which is about what it was when they first proposed, it wasn't maybe a couple million years old in the beginning, but very early it started jumping in longer and longer periods until we have our 4.6 billion year thing for the Earth history now. But the thing about it is, even 1 million years takes it way out of line from any kind of biblical chronological thing. Noah's flood, was about 1656 years after the creation, which was about 6,000 years ago, based on a straightforward biblical chronology. Well, the two are just antithetical. But if he did not publish that Principles of Geology, Then Darwin, his idea of change over time, which no one's ever seen,
Right.
he wouldn't have the time, so that wouldn't have happened. So, and if that doesn't happen, are we saying that perhaps Karl Marx and Hitler, Nietzsche, and all the horrible things that might have, I submit that based on the nature of the world, things like that would have happened for other reasons. But these are the ones we have.
If you look at history, it isn't as if wars and rumors of wars didn't
Occur long before
throughout
Darwin.
history,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly right. Yeah.
And you had a lot of wars being fought over religious reasons and for carnal reasons, which even in the Civil War you had people saying God was on their side because and it was his cause that they were trying to promote. And neither one were that correct in that regard. You know?
No, not.
And so really what you have is a lot of debating that goes on in the world concerning what is really evil and what is good. And those debates occur today. But with Darwin's theory, what you have is that people get the opportunity to make up their own real rules.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this. I am convinced if there was any other theory other than Darwinism which would allow you to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, you'd abandon Darwinism years ago. Because Darwin has so many holes in it. Anybody who studies it knows it does. There's too many. I mean,
Well, Darwin knew it.
And Darwin knew it, but it's gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better since his day. I mean, you go from the macrobiologic to the microbiologic, and there's still these insurmountable gaps, breaks in between kinds of animals, species, things. There's not this great chain of being that they really believed in the late 1700s, which Erasmus Darwin was involved in that. Of course, Charles, went up with that as well. But Doug, the What If universe, if they did not publish those books, our very TV show is called The Revolution Against Evolution.
Yeah, no,
but we have a
all of
TV
sudden-
show,
And so that would change the nature of what we do,
Right, it would, yeah.
I've been asking myself a question, am I really concentrating so much upon doing something to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution that we may be actually missing the scientific joys that we should be enjoying as a result of knowing God as creator and learning about his works. Because
on the other hand, Doug, I got to tell you, I mean, you brought up some of these things. The biology. What's the name of the program? The rate, and what was the other one with the cell? Not the human genome, but the creationary thing. They were finding
Gene Project.
Gene Project. These things are coming about. Basically, evolution challenges. Sometimes, Doug, I wonder the Lord allows things to happen.
I think so.
To challenge us to get off our dead butt and do something. Because if everything's so easy, we just sit around and don't do things in this world. Right. In this fallen world, we tend to look. If people were, this is going to sound really awful, but it's like if people really had to work, if they didn't work, they would not eat. Some people might still starve, but a lot less would be on wealth. If we didn't have a welfare state, you'd have a lot more productivity people. But if you can get a paycheck with it sitting on your butt, a lot of people will opt for that, even though your living is not very high. You can always do better if you're working for yourself. But I'm saying, well, that's the same thing with Doug, with intellectual pursuits too.
Right.
If you're not, I think that one of the greatest things that happened in the United States was we talk about separation of church and state. And the atheists like to use that as a club against Christians. But the reality was, it was Christians that proposed separation of church and state. They did not want a theocracy here. They did not want a state church in America. And I submit that Christianity in America has remained much healthier despite the onslaught, especially in recent years, because we were forced to compete in the arena of ideas.
Right, yeah.
And the European church is dead because they were sponsored by the state and their tax dollars did it. And the fact of the matter is now you got a bunch of old people going to, I mean, there's some young people, but it's by and large, most of the young people are just alienated. And we've had to compete in the arena of ideas. Same thing, Doug, about we're fighting against evolution, but it's challenged and honed our real antithetical and intellectual reasoning
Yeah,
for things. I think
you
in a lot
don't
of
have a
ways.
testimony unless you have a test. And part of
I think that's
the,
detestable.
and I see, in my own life, my own Christianity wasn't really very much energized until I actually started college, and started to come up against the ideas that was resisting my own foundation, which was a Christian upbringing. And if you you grew up in the church, sometimes going to church week after week, you hear the same message every week, and you
Or at least every
see
Christmas and Easter, you're going to get a Christmas and Easter message.
right, yeah, and you see the same people every week, and the devil points out their faults.
Yeah.
And guess what? Eventually, you get a little bit disillusioned with all of that, and you wonder, well, is there more to it than what I'm really seeing?
Yeah, complacency is really the really first step to apathy, and that which is the next step to basically disinterest, the next step to disillusionment, and the next step is just abandonment. And I think that's what happens with all too often when that happens. You end up in these Christian ghettos, we used to call them. Mm-hmm. The Lord really exposes us to ideas that we need to. Most of us don't like that, though. I mean, let's face it, Doug.
Right.
None of us okay, first of all, think about everything in nature, Doug. To get ourselves, you want to get a six-pack? Well, I got a keg, but, the reality is, to get a six-pack, you got to work, you got to stress, We don't like doing that. Rather than running and working, we'd rather sit on our butt and watch TV. I know I would. And it's the same thing with intellectual and moral and spiritual things, Doug. We would rather just kind of sit in our little comfort zone and go along to get along. But eventually it becomes very stale and dead. And the Lord knows it, especially, I'm not saying, because Doug, I've challenged myself when you said about what the next life, as residents of heaven, what should we be concentrating on? And I think about it, Doug, how is it we're going to be in heaven and never get bored? Because we're not going to be challenged in these ways.
Right, yeah.
And that's, to me, a very interesting thought, because it's going to be, we think in terms of perhaps God will have challenges and things to do and all. I don't know. The reality is it's so far beyond our measure, because we only know, Doug, how to relate in a fallen world.
Well, one thing I can think of is some of the things that we've already been doing and started to do is you and I and a lot of our group have taken some trips, and we've gone out west to explore God's creation.
That's true.
And see the beauty of what God has created in His world. And even in this fallen world, where you have canyons and evidences for catastrophe left over from Noah's flood, what you have is incredible beauty that is brought about as a result of that. You have all the beautiful layers of rocks, the trees, and the
colors.
And it becomes an artist's palette, and you as an artist can appreciate that.
I love it, Doug, because everything in life is like that. You think about the challenge of it is that, out of oftentimes in human experience, Doug, no one likes tragedy, but out of tragedy, all of a sudden you become a stronger, better, a more powerful or more loving or whatever. There's a lot of things. You could be destroyed if you let yourself. But the fact of the matter is, the catastrophes of the past in the physical arena, Doug, in those ways, are sort of like an allegory to us in our life, because the Lord allows us to go through things, trials. Even in the Scripture, it talks about we're refined like gold. Mm-hmm. Or it talks about the silver, where they boil it, they melt it, and they skim off the impurities. Well, to get pure silver, you've probably heard this analogy. The idea that you keep heating it, heat does not feel good too much. It hurts.
That's right, yeah.
But you get the impurities out. But then what the idea is you can actually you see your reflection in it. And in this case, the reflection is a reflection of the Lord Himself. That's what He's trying to hone out of us. But it's interesting how so much what we would call evil or destruction, we can look at it in hindsight or after the fact and see beautiful things that have come out of it. And it sounds really almost Pollyannish, but there's a lot of truth to that. The Lord is, in His mercy, even in a cursed world, He's shown beauty. He's shown redemption. He's shown salvation. He's shown restoration.
So what
That's
we're talking
powerful.
about, Rich, is the art of science.
The art of science? Well, yeah, maybe that's okay.
Yeah, it's appreciating God's beauty and creation as a result. How would this change creation research? Is the next question. Is if there was no Darwin to
Fight
browse
against?
about,
Yeah.
Uh,
If we actually had the wherewithal to want to really find out about God's creation without that sandpaper to rough off like Darwinian, we would go after the things that we're finding, like the genome or the genome project, or what do you call the gene project. We would look at but I mean, Deb, what's amazing is how often we don't it's like we don't strive enough unless we have something to strive against. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah, reverse engineering the DNA code is a real challenge, and it's something that would really be a worthwhile project for a creationist to undertake, is to just try to understand a little part of the genetic code of what makes up life, and also understand what makes every creature that God has created unique.
I think the thing is, Doug, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. The thing about what would we do if we didn't have Darwin, I think more scientists would be predisposed to be looking for God's handiwork, as opposed to trying to substantiate why there is no God.
You'd be starting with Paley.
Yeah.
And the natural
Exactly. Yeah.
theology.
Evidence. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
it's interesting that Darwin admired Paley's work, and yet he found certain things in his own heart that he wanted to be able to refute Paley, and that was the impetus for what he ended up doing in his work of evolution. And the next question I might ask is, if there was no Darwin and no evolution,
No Lyell.
not Lyell, how would God's perspective on history change? How would we be able to view history based upon what we see in the Bible versus what prehistory, so-called prehistory?
Well, we wouldn't really
There'd be
believe
no
we
prehistoric
wouldn't believe in
thing.
prehistoric stuff. We all realize that from a biblical perspective, it's all historical. Okay.
Right.
We would know that dinosaurs were not prehistoric reptiles. Even once in a while you talk about dinosaurs, and you almost have the Darwinian worldview has inculcated itself, infiltrated into the culture so much, you can't talk about a dinosaur without calling it a prehistoric animal.
Right.
But the reality is, from a biblical perspective, it's not prehistoric. It was written after Adam and Eve were created. Therefore, everything's been historically recorded in at least the Bible, if not other historical records. Okay, but I think our perspective. Our perspective of God, of history, would be the same as the biblical one. I believe it would be. It's a fairly recent universe in one. Although 6,000 years is a long time.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's a long time. But when you get this deep time stuff, we would also, Doug, our perspective, we would realize, with humility, hopefully, that we are truly made in the image of God. We're not some gnat at the end of a cosmic burp. We basically really we have. There's a reason for us to be here, and it's also we would also, I think, really explore the idea how neat it is that God has left a lot to our imaginations to try to discover.
Right.
And we might not have as many vain imaginations. We might actually have more productive ones. But with the fallen nature still in operation, even despite the fact of no Darwin, as you mentioned earlier, we still had wars, people hating each other. Cain killed his own brother. You haven't needed an excuse to kill each other since the very beginning. So there have been evils, but I can't even imagine what other evil would have been promoted. I'm not saying Darwin, what he did was, I believe, a damnable heresy, okay, evolution. But he himself was a fairly gracious guy. He was an atheist. got more atheistic at the end of his life, actually. But it's the fruit of his labors that tell the tale. We've
Right,
had
yeah.
millions and millions of dying and dead people and killing because of these theories. It's really bad. Way more than almost anything you can say. You know, that even including the Islamic and the Inquisitions. Yeah, there's been so much more death and in such a concentrated form.
One of the things that it was bothering me about this is I was trying to contemplate what God eventually wants me to be like over the next 20, 30, 50 years that I'm going to be alive.
Yeah.
And I was looking at what I was doing was basing a lot of my energy on fighting against Darwinism, whereas maybe there's a different perspective I need to take a look at, from a heavenly perspective. I noticed that I said to myself, when we get to heaven, there's going to be stuff to do and to concentrate on and to learn about, because he's got an entire universe and eternity to work
Yeah, I know.
with.
I think about that.
And there's a lot of occupations that aren't needed in heaven. Take, for example, you're not going to need soldiers. You're not going to be
No.
in the military. You're not going to need cops. You won't need somebody to pick up the garbage. I saw things like this mechanism to track child support and social workers, and even charities.
Charities will be obsolete.
And prisons, and these things are all extra things that we need in this world.
Doug,
to
your prisons, he's got no more prisons,
right.
no more jails, no more hunger. So yeah, charities. But Doug, the Bible also talks about things that God himself has established that are going to be done away with.
Right.
We're not going to need like special knowledge and speaking in tongues and prophecies, and they're all going to go away.
Right. Yeah.
So those are going to be unnecessary as well, because the reason why is because we're going to have the whole enchilada. God's there, everything's taken care of, and I may have mentioned this on a show before. I can't really recall, but I was musing some of these same kind of thoughts you were doing, Doug, and I said, Lord, how is it we're going to live forever and never get bored?
Right.
And the Lord just spoke. It wasn't in an audible voice, but it was such a strong impression. And he said, because I am. And now, for those who are unfamiliar with that, the word I am is the English equivalent of the tetragrammaton. It means Yahweh, if you will, Jehovah. That's the name, that word means to be or eternally existent. But he basically was telling me, he says, don't worry about it. I got this covered.
Right.
You will never be bored in heaven. You will never be without purpose, meaning, life, exuberance, and joy. These are things we can't maintain down here for very long. We can get excited and joyful. But it's almost in this world, Doug, we almost, like we talk about, we need bad things to kind of spark us to do good things.
Right.
We need tragedy to help us to be, that's not going to be necessary
That's
in the age to come. And so there's going to be a lot of rethinking on our parts, too. When they talk about the transformation, Doug, it's not merely our bodies that are going to get changed so they never wear out. It's our soul that's going to be changed in a way that I can't even really fathom, quite frankly. But that was a very strong word I got, and I thought to myself, that is a powerful word, because I am. And that's all he said, but it was so pregnant with meaning, so full of powerful, but it was like, kind of like the edge of a dream you couldn't quite grasp. You couldn't quite, what does that really mean? But it's
Right.
just bigger than I could
It's sort of
possibly
like a
imagine.
newspaper that has just good news in it. And the question is, would it be boring? To many people it might be, but you get so tired of seeing all the bad news in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Why do people gravitate towards bad news?
Well, it reveals again our nature. This fallen, broken world, our nature does gravitate to bad more than it does to good.
You see it in the movies and lot of different things is that the horrible stuff just comes out. And, you know, I got to thinking, well, what if I started a good newspaper? What would it look like?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'd have a lot of humor in it. Okay. And you know, it's just going to be a lot of fun and great things and testimony of great things that have happened, and then also there'd be information, there'd be learning, there'd be revealing of things that are important, and you know, that would be what I think might be nice to have in a.
But again, Doug, I think without our being reshaped for the heavenly mind, we, even as Christians, I'm sorry, we go to Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, we want him to kill the bad guy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like we're not exempt from those feelings, even as believers. And so we're gonna be reshaped, Doug, because I agree with you. But there may be obviously there's other things even beyond that. Because Doug, we in this life, we can see some of those. We see humor, we see information given, we see testimonies of people who have done amazing things. All these things, I think, is because God allows us to see glimpses of the good things, even in a broken world. And that's I think He wants us to get through the fog of all of this stuff. Not necessarily to ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist, or even that you're not even interested in it, but to realize there's a better way. Ultimately, it's the heavenly way. You know.
And I think scientific progress has been held back by the theory of evolution. And you know, taken for an example, Dr. Don DeYoung's book, Discovery of Design. What he did was he pointed out all these different things, engineering things that we have co-opted from God's creation.
Oh, how many times have we?
Yeah, and we've mimicked and copied all this good stuff that we see in the design of things. Like we had the one example of the beech leaf that folds up like into a little pod, and then when it comes apart, it just unfolds real nicely. And there's the burrs was the inspiration for the
Velcro.
Velcro, yep. And a lot of these different things, you know. And then there's just all these different things that God has created, which is interesting, like the platypus, the electric eel, the wombat whose pouch goes towards the rear instead of in the front, and like the design of the egg and of ATP and all these different things that God has made.
Well, you're bringing up a can of worms right at the end of the show here, Doug. ATP is all showing itself almost, you know.
Yeah. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution. We hope you enjoyed our show.